This show is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network.
To join our community Discord or see more content from our members, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dragon Mind, the TTRPG podcast where we discover our best selves through gaming. Today, we're continuing our D&D 2024 Practical Possibilities coverage with the 2024 Sorcerer. If you want to contact me directly, you can message me in the Darkmoor Podcast community Discord or email me at dragonmindpodcast@gmail.com, all linked in the description below. So, I thought it'd be fun to follow up Barbarian with Sorcerer. Since, according to Jeremy Crawford, the 2024 redesigned Sorcerer is like the Barbarian of spellcasters. To distinguish it from its spellcasting cousin, the Wizard, the new Sorcerer has a new signature feature, Innate Sorcery, which, like Rage, is a bonus action that activates a minute-long self-buff, increasing the power of the Sorcerer's spells. Now, it's easy to draw the distinction between the two. With the Wizard, a player will have more spells, while with the Sorcerer, a player's spells will hit harder when they want them to. Between managing Innate Sorcery, Metamagic, and the bonus spells granted by subclasses, the Sorcerer is truly a higher complexity class than the Wizard. Getting into the nitty-gritty, what's changed between the 2014 and 2024 versions? To elaborate on Innate Sorcery, as a bonus action, a Sorcerer can enter a state of heightened magical power, meaning that for a minute, they have advantage on spell attacks and their spell save DC goes up by 1 when they cast Sorcerer spells. That's going to be important when we talk about multiclassing. This means that the Sorcerer is probably going to be ahead of most casters in terms of combat capability, especially at earlier levels. There's an ongoing debate in the optimization community over whether or not Wizard or Sorcerer is the more powerful class in the 2024 PHB. Personally, I think it's going to take about a year of actual play experience before there's a consensus, but if I had to put money on it, I don't know, I think right now I'd probably lean toward the Wizard, only because the strength of the Wizard has always been its spell selection, rather than the pure oomph of its spells. Although, talking it out, I do think that the combination of Innate Sorcery and Metamagic really helps narrow the gap. So again, we'll need some actual play data in order to make a solid judgment. Just know both classes are really good selections. And speaking of narrowing that gap, one thing you may notice is that Sorcerers now have more spell preparations, especially at lower levels. One of the downsides of the 2014 Sorcerer was that it had very few spells known. Now it's in a much better place. So with Innate Sorcery being gained at first level, the Sorcerer's subclass has been pushed back to third, which has also bumped Metamagic up to second. It's nice to see Metamagic gained earlier, as it was the Sorcerer's signature feature in 2014, even though it was gained fairly late in its leveling progression in comparison to other signature features. You can also change your Metamagic selections each time you level up, meaning you're not stuck with your choices in the same way you were in 2014. At 5th level, Sorcerer gets Sorceress Restoration, which used to be its 20th level feature. Now it's gained all the way down at 5th, allowing you to regain some spent sorcery points after a short rest once per day. This is a much more appropriate level to gain this feature. At 7th, Sorcery Incarnate allows sorcerers that run out of Innate Sorcery uses to spend 2 sorcery points to activate it again. In addition, while Innate Sorcery is up, they can use up to 2 Metamagic options instead of 1 on a spell. And finally, the 20th level feature is completely new. Arcane Apotheosis allows you to get a free use of Metamagic each turn while Innate Sorcery is active. In the playtest, I'm pretty sure Arcane Apotheosis gave you a free use of Wish, kind of like the Cleric's Greater Divine Intervention. This is not as powerful as that, but it is an improvement over having Sorceress Restoration here. And that's about all when it comes to mechanical changes. The 2024 Sorcerer actually has a distinct mechanical identity. It's no longer just the Charisma Wizard without a lot of spells. So when a new player is coming and asking whether they should pick a wizard or a sorcerer, the choice is a little bit clearer. Personally, if it's a newer player, I'd probably have them lean more toward wizard. As I said in the wizard episode, I find that in this edition, wizards are an average complexity class, probably on the higher side of average, whereas sorcerer is definitively in the high complexity category. The only real system wizards have to learn are spellcasting mechanics and preparing their spells. Sorcerers, on the other hand, not only have that, but they have to know when best to time their innate sorcery activation, how to budget sorcery points, which meta magic options are best for their playstyle, and when to use them. There's a lot of micromanagement to Sorcerer, and that can make it a lot more difficult to grasp for a new player. That being said, in terms of role, Sorcerer is going to occupy a similar function to Wizard, although because it has less spells known, it's probably going to lean a little bit away from utility and a little bit more toward combat. They have very similar spell lists, but another of their big differences is their subclasses. Now, as usual, I'm going to rank these subclasses in order from least to most complex. But again, reviewing the wizard subclasses we had two more combat-focused ones in Abjuration and Evocation, but then we had two nuanced subclasses in the form of Divination and Illusion. The Sorcerer subclasses, just like in 2014, are based off of the origin of your sorceress magic, and as you'll see, in general, they kind of lean more toward combat too. So the simplest in our ranking is Draconic Sorcery. So right at 3rd level, it adds some nice survivability features, including an increase to your hit points and adding an unarmored defense. And they also get a few bonus spells, although I find that they're more thematic than just powerful. Personally, the standouts to me are Command at 3rd level and Fear at 5th. At 6th, they get Elemental Affinity, granting them resistance to an elemental damage type, and you get to add your Charisma modifier to damage roll of spells you cast that deal that damage type. It's a straightforward subclass. You get some defensive boosts at 3rd, you get another defensive boost at 6th, and a damage bump at 6th. It's nice and straightforward, and even as you get to the higher level features, it's just going to help you focus your playstyle. Now, in terms of complexity, I think next up is Wild Magic. Now, this is the only 2024 Sorcerer subclass to not get an expanded spell list, but it's because you're getting an entire Wild Magic Surge table with random effects and spells that are activated with the pair of 3rd level features, Wild Magic Surge and Tides of Chaos. In 2014, Wild Magic was notorious for having Mother May I mechanics, having all of the control in the DM's hands, whereas with these two features, now it's up to the player to be able to choose when they're going to roll on the Wild Magic Surge table. Now, this is a unique gameplay loop to Wild Magic Sorcerer, which is why I think it's more complicated than Draconic. But once you get the hang of it, really it's just rolling on a table. It's not like you have an entire other expanded spell list to manage. So it's not complicated, it's just chaotic and random. Of all of the revised subclasses, I think Wild Magic Sorcerer is universally the most praised. It's so different from anything else in the PHB, and especially for players that just like to see what's going to happen, it can certainly add some randomness to the game. Next up in terms of complexity is a subclass that originally appeared in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, which is the Clockwork Soul. Both Clockwork Soul and Aberrant Mind, which is also from Tasha's, appear in this PHB. They're similar in that they both add a pretty lengthy expanded spell list, and like Draconic Sorcery, kind of narrow the sorcerer's playstyle in one direction. With Clockwork Soul, it kind of feels like it's a sorcerer with a little bit of cleric. There's a lot of support spells and some restoration, like lesser and greater restoration. Unlike Wild Magic, though, which is about being random, Clockwork Soul is about helping your team perform more reliably. Their 3rd level feature cancels out advantage or disadvantage, giving you potentially a better chance to get the result you want, whether it's an ally rolling or a foe. Now, one big change from the Tasha's version is that in Tasha's, as you leveled up, you could swap out these expanded spells for other spells of the same school, which led to some pretty bonkers builds. That little paragraph has been removed, so the expanded spells are what you get, which I think is fine. Looking at some of the possibilities that Tasha's version would give, it made those subclasses just so much better than anything else. So looking at these four next to each other, it just feels a little more balanced. Aberrant Mind is the subclass I think is the most complicated for the Sorcerer. The playstyle is just a little more nuanced. It lacks the raw power of Draconic or Clockwork Soul, and a lot of its features are utility-based. So the spells you get are things like Calm Emotions, Detect Thoughts, and Sending, and Telepathic Speech is a social interaction feature as opposed to combat. You can have a lot of fun with this one, but I do think it's going to take a certain player type to bring the most out of it. As for multiclassing, Sorcerer maintains the build diversity it held in 2014, although I don't think the combinations are as volatile as they were. Overall, there are 4 charisma-based spellcasters in the game, which means you can combine them with each other without having to split your ability score progression. One note here, as a reminder, innate sorcery only works with your sorcerer spells, although meta magic doesn't have the same restriction, which for example means you can combine levels with something like Valor Bard. The Valor Bard can use extra attack, replace one of their weapon attacks with a cantrip, and still quicken another action spell into a bonus action. Now, remember that these investments also mean you're not really going to get the highest level spells, but it can be a fun combination if, say, you're playing a one-shot or a short campaign with a set level cap, like one of the officially printed Wizards modules that ends at like 8th or 12th level. Now, I'll get into my gripes with the choices or lack thereof they made with Eldritch Blast when we finally cover Warlock, but Sorlock is still a viable build. The way Eldritch Blast works is it still increases power based on character level, meaning that you can 2-level dip into Warlock and get Sorlock with a full Eldritch Blast, Agonizing Blast progression. The efficacy of this build has been changed just because the marshals have gotten boosted enough that when it comes to single target damage, this is still a viable option to increase the damage per round of sorcerers, but sorcerers aren't great single target damage dealers to begin with. Optimizer Treant Monk did a ranking of different classes when it comes to single target damage, and sorcerers by themselves came in 8th out of 10, even with innate sorcery. And because Eldritch Blast is a warlock spell, it's not going to interact with innate sorcery. Finally, Sorcerer has historically been a decent multi-class with paladins. A lot of the reasons why you do it would be to give the paladin more spell slots to smite with. However, now that Divine Smite is a bonus action, it makes quickening spells a lot less powerful than in 2014. Sorcerer spells can still increase a paladin's versatility, it's just not going to have the same overpowered action economy that it used to, which I think is fine. One of my chief complaints about the 2014 version of 5e was that oftentimes multi-classing a character got you a more powerful version of a character concept than single classing. And although I'm sure there are still examples of that in 2024, for the most part, when I look at multi-classing now, it's about increasing versatility because the later level progressions for the most part are better. Sorcerer is a great example of that. It used to be I would always dip 2 levels of Warlock just to get a nice DPR bump, and in a lot of cases I'd hit harder than the marshals. But the redesigns now make that graph look a little different. Overall, I think that this is a great example of how the game is in a healthier place. You can still create cool characters you want through multiclassing, but power levels are going to look a little bit more even. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Dragon Mind is a proud member of the Darkmoor Podcast Network. To discover more TTRPG content like this, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com. If you had any insights or questions, be sure to email us at dragonmindpodcast@gmail.com or post in our discussion channel in the Darkmoor Podcast community Discord, linked in the description below. Our theme song, J-Pop, is brought to you by Theslian Studios. You can check out more of their awesome work at theslianstudios.com. Have an awesome day, and remember, your story matters. Bye-bye now.
Well, Grimton, Morlinde and Ulrich are gone. We're in a new, unfamiliar land of Kolgafir. What's our first move?
Polaris, I'm not too certain, but I did hear Fishbelly talking about something.
Oh, yeah. With the Warlord's half-sister in a meeting.
Yeah, that's about the only lead we have so far. We haven't been here long. Might be worth checking out.
Seems like a plan to me.
Join us as our party explores an unforgiving region of the Cusp and allies with new party members in Arc 3 of Advantage, a 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons audio drama focused on storytelling and character development, in the Darkmoor Podcast Network. Find us in your podcast app.